Sometimes the worst moment of your life leads to the best chapter you never saw coming. When you lose everything, you discover what you're truly made of. Freydis was a widow with nowhere left to turn. Her own village had cast her out after a scandal destroyed her reputation. The only job available was the one nobody wanted, servant to Jarl Einar, the most feared Viking lord in the north. Everyone said he was cruel and violent. Everyone said his hall was a place of suffering. But Freydis had nothing left to lose. What she found there wasn't the monster people described. Behind those stone walls was a household broken by grief, not cruelty. A man hollowed by war, not born evil. As she used her healing skills and quiet strength, something unexpected happened. Could the place everyone feared become the home she'd always been searching for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like a shroud as Freydis made her way along the rocky path toward Jarl Einar's stronghold. Her worn leather boots found purchase on stone slick with dew, each step taking her further from the life she'd known and closer to an uncertain future. The weight of her healing pouch against her hip provided small comfort. It contained everything she had left of value in this world. Dot behind her lay the village of Stavanger, where she'd been born, married, widowed, and ultimately cast out. The scandal that had destroyed her standing there felt like a lifetime ago, though barely 3 moons had passed since the accusations began. She tried to explain, tried to make them understand that her actions had been those of a healer, not a seduceress. But grief and fear make poor listeners, and soon the whispers became shouts, the shouts became stones, and the stones became exile. The messenger who'd brought word of the position at Einar's hall had been careful not to meet her eyes. "The Jarl needs a servant," he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone to tend the household. The work is hard, the pay is poor, and..." He'd paused then, swallowing hard. And the last 3 women didn't last a month between them. Freydis had accepted on the spot. What choice did she have? Now, as the first glimpse of the stronghold came into view through the morning fog, she understood why those women had fled. The hall rose from the rocky outcropping like something carved from the bones of the earth itself. Massive timber walls stretched skyward, bound with iron and crowned with the carved heads of snarling wolves. The great iron gate stood closed, its surface black as a winter night and twice as forbidding. This was no mere chieftain's holding. This was the seat of power for one of the most feared men in all the northern lands. Stories of Jarl Einar's conquests had reached even her small village, tales of battles won through sheer brutality, of enemies who'd begged for mercy and received only death, of a man whose very name could silence a room full of warriors. As she approached the gate, Freydis noticed the silence. No sounds of daily life drifted from within, no children's laughter, no women's voices raised in song, no clatter of everyday work. The few servants she could see moving about the outer courtyard did so quickly, their heads down, as if afraid to be noticed. A guard emerged from the gatehouse, his hand resting on his sword hilt. He was young, perhaps no more than 20 winters, but his eyes held the wary look of someone who'd learned to expect trouble. "State your business," he said, though his tone suggested he already knew. "I'm Freydis, daughter of Thorvald," she replied, straightening her shoulders despite the fear gnawing at her stomach. "I've come about the position in the household." The guard's expression shifted from wariness to something approaching pity. "Aye, we've been expecting you." He stepped aside, pulling open a smaller door set within the great gate. "Best to get you settled before the Jarl returns from his morning ride. He doesn't like..." The young man stopped himself, shaking his head. "Just come along." The courtyard beyond the gate was vast and well-maintained, but eerily quiet. Servants, moved about their tasks like shadows, speaking in whispers when they spoke at all. The very air seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something terrible to happen. "That's the kitchen," the guard said, pointing to a low building that leaked appetizing smells into the morning air. "Ingrid runs it. She's been here longer than anyone. The wash house is there. The store's beyond that. The great hall." He gestured toward the massive central building, its roof carved with intricate patterns that seemed to writhe in the shifting light. "That's where the Jarl holds court. You'll not need to go there unless summoned." "The way," he said. Summoned made it clear. This was not something to hope for. They passed a group of women hanging washing on lines strung between posts. At the sound of footsteps, they looked up with startled expressions, their eyes immediately seeking the guard's face before settling on Freydis with undisguised curiosity. One of them, a woman perhaps 10 years older than Freydis with graying hair and kind eyes, offered a tentative smile. "That's Astrid," the guard murmured. "She manages the household stores." Good woman, but again he stopped himself from finishing the thought. Freydis was beginning to understand. This wasn't just a place where people were afraid of their lord. It was a place where fear had become so commonplace that it shaped every interaction, every word, every gesture. The servants' quarters were located in a long, low building attached to the main hall. The guard pushed open a heavy wooden door, revealing a corridor lined with small chambers. "Third door on the right," he said. "Your things." He looked at her single cloth bundle with something like embarrassment. "Well, there's a bed and a chest for your belongings. Meals are at dawn, midday, and dusk. Ingrid will tell you your duties." The chamber was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a wooden chest, and a single window that looked out over the fjord. After months of sleeping rough or begging shelter from reluctant relatives, it felt like luxury. Freydis set down her bundle and touched the healing pouch at her side. Whatever happened here, she would endure it. She had to. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. The woman she'd seen hanging, washing Astrid, peered in with a cautious expression. "May I come in?" "Of course." Freydis gestured her inside. Grateful for any human contact that didn't seem tinged with fear, Astrid entered and quietly closed the door behind her. For a moment, she simply studied Freydis with eyes that held deep intelligence and deeper sadness. "You're the new girl," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "I am, Freydis, the daughter of Thorvald." "I knew your father," Astrid said, surprising her. "Good man. Honorable trader." "I heard about," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "I heard about your troubles in Stavanger." Freydis felt her cheeks burn. Even here, her shame had preceded her. "I see my reputation travels faster than I do." "Not your reputation," Astrid said gently. "Your true character. There are those who know what really happened, who understand that you acted with a healer's heart, not a seducer's intent. The truth, as a way of surfacing, even when lies flow faster." The kindness in her voice nearly broke Freydis's carefully maintained composure. She'd grown so accustomed to suspicious glances and whispered accusations that simple human understanding felt like a physical blow. "Why are you telling me this?" Freydis asked. Astrid moved to the window, gazing out at the gray waters of the fjord. "Because you'll need to remember who you really are in this place. It's easy to lose yourself here, to become so focused on survival that you forget you have anything else to offer." She turned back to Freydis, her expression serious. "But we could use someone who remembers how to heal, how to offer comfort. It's been a long time since this hall knew peace." Before Freydis could ask what she meant, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the courtyard. Astrid immediately tensed, her entire demeanor shifting from warm to wary in an instant. "He's back," she whispered. "Remember, keep your head down. Speak only when spoken to, and never, ever contradict him." The last girl who did She shook her head, unwilling to finish the sentence. Through the window, Freydis caught her first glimpse of Jarl Einar. Even at a distance, his presence was unmistakable. Tall and broad-shouldered, he sat his horse like a man born to command. His dark hair was bound back in warrior braids, and even from here she could see the network of scars that mapped his. Arms evidence of countless battles fought and won. But it wasn't his size or his scars that made her breath catch. It was the way the servants in the courtyard reacted to his presence. They didn't just bow, they seemed to shrink, to make themselves as small and unnoticeable as possible. The very air seemed to grow heavier with his arrival. As if sensing her gaze, Einar looked up toward the servants' quarters. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Freydis felt a chill run down her spine. His gaze wasn't cruel, exactly, but it was empty, devoid of warmth or human connection. It was the look of a man who'd seen too much, done too much, and felt too little. Then he looked away, dismounting and striding toward the great hall with the purposeful gait of a predator. The servants scattered before him like leaves before a storm wind. "Now you understand," Astrid murmured, still watching from the window. "That's why the others left. Not because he's violent, though he can be, but because living under that emptiness, that cold silence, it wears at you. It makes you forget what warmth feels like." As the day wore on and Astrid showed her the routines of the household, Freydis began to understand the true nature of her new home. The servants worked efficiently but joylessly, speaking in whispers when they spoke at all. The great hall, where meals were served, felt more like a tomb than a center of community life. Einar sat at the high table in brooding silence, his presence casting a pall over the entire room. But beneath the fear and silence, Freydis sensed something else, a deep, pervading sadness that seemed to seep from the very stones of the hall. This wasn't the cruelty of a tyrant who enjoyed others' suffering. This was the aftermath of some great tragedy, a wound that had never healed and had infected everything around it. As she lay in her narrow bed that first night, listening to the wind howl off the fjord, Freydis touched her healing pouch and made herself a promise. She would survive here. She had no choice. But perhaps, if she was careful and patient, she might do more than merely survive. Perhaps she could find a way to heal what was broken in this place. Outside her window, storm clouds gathered over the dark waters, and somewhere in the depths of the great hall, she could hear the sound of a man walking alone through empty corridors, his footsteps echoing like a heartbeat in an abandoned chest. 3 days had passed since Freydis' arrival, and she'd begun to understand the delicate rhythms of life in Einar's hall. The servants moved through their duties with practiced efficiency, but always with one ear turned toward the sound of their lord's approach. She'd learned to recognize the warning signs, the sudden stiffening of shoulders, the quick exchange of glances, the way conversations died mid-sentence, when heavy footsteps echoed from the main corridor. This morning had started like the others. Freydis had risen before dawn to help Ingrid prepare the morning meal, her hands already growing familiar with the layout of the kitchen and the preferences of the household. The older woman had proven to be taciturn but fair, offering instruction without friendship, correction without cruelty. "The Jarl takes his porridge with honey, nothing more," Ingrid had said, ladling the steaming mixture into a wooden bowl. "And mind the ale he prefers at room temperature, not warmed like the others." It was such a small human detail that it had surprised Freydis. Somehow, she'd expected a man of Einar's fearsome reputation to subsist on raw meat and blood, not porridge sweetened with honey like any ordinary person. She was carrying the bowl toward the great hall when she heard a child's laugh, bright and musical, cutting through the usual morning silence like sunlight through storm clouds. The sound was so unexpected in this place of perpetual gloom that Freydis nearly dropped the bowl. The laughter came from a small alcove near the servants. Stairs, where a little girl of perhaps 6 winters sat playing with a carved wooden horse. The toy was beautifully made, its surface worn smooth by countless small hands, its mane detailed with tiny braided threads. The child was completely absorbed in her play, trotting the horse through an imaginary landscape while making soft whinnying sounds. For a moment, Freydis simply watched, struck by the incongruity of such innocent joy in this somber place. The girl had Einar's dark hair, though hers fell in loose curls around her shoulders, and when she looked up, Freydis saw that she shared his deep-set eyes as well. "Hello," the child said with the unself-conscious friendliness of the very young. "Are you the new lady who helps in the kitchen?" "I am," Freydis replied, setting down the bowl and crouching to the child's level. "What's your name?" "Sigrid," the girl said proudly. "And this is Sleipnir." She held up the wooden horse. "Papa carved him for me before he went to fight the sea. Wolves. Would you like to see how fast he can run?" Before Freydis could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both look up. Einar rounded the corner, his expression shifting from neutral to thunderous as he took in the scene. His daughter playing openly in the corridor, a servant crouched beside her, his morning meal growing cold on the floor. "Sigrid," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "What have I told you about playing in the corridors?" The child's face immediately crumpled, all trace of joy vanishing as if it had never existed. "I'm sorry, Papa. You were just making noise and disrupting the household's work," he cut her off, his gaze moving to Freydis with something that might have been accusation. "And you," he addressed Freydis without looking directly at her. "Your duties do not include entertaining children." Freydis felt anger flare in her chest, not at the rebuke, which she'd expected, but at the way the light had died in Sigrid's eyes. Without thinking, she stood and faced the Jarl directly. "The child was playing quietly," she said, her voice calm but firm. She disturbed no one. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the usual background sounds of the household seemed to cease, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Einar's eyes locked with hers, and for a moment she saw something flicker in their depth surprise, perhaps or anger so deep it had moved beyond rage into something colder. "You forget yourself," he said, each word precise and cutting. "In my hall, children learn discipline. They learn that there is a time for everything, and play is not welcome when there is work to be done. And what of joy?" The words escaped before Freydis could stop them. "What of laughter? Are these also forbidden in your hall?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Astrid had appeared at the end of the corridor, her face pale with horror. Several other servants had begun to gather, drawn by the unprecedented sound of someone speaking back to their lord. Einar took a step closer, and Freydis could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the leather and steel that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the promise of violence. "Joy is a luxury," he said. "Laughter is weakness. In this world, both will get you killed faster than any sword." His gaze moved to his daughter, who had pressed herself against the wall as if trying to disappear. "Sigrid knows this. She knows that soft things do not survive." "She's a child," Freydis protested, her healer's instincts overriding her common sense. Children need to learn the truth of the world before the world teaches it to them with blood and pain." Einar cut her off. He reached down and plucked the wooden horse from Sigrid's nerveless fingers. For a moment, he stared at the toy with an expression Freydis couldn't read. Then, without warning, he hurled it against the stone wall. The horse shattered on impact, its beautifully carved head breaking away from its body, the tiny braided mane scattering like autumn leaves. Sigrid let out a small wounded sound, not quite a cry, but the sharp intake of breath that comes just before tears. "Toys break," Einar said, his voice flat and emotionless. Hearts break. People die. The sooner she learns this, the stronger she be. He turned on his heel and strode away, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to echo. Sigrid stared at the broken pieces of her horse, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. She didn't cry. Freydis suspected the child had. Learned long ago that tears brought more pain than comfort in this place. After Einar's footsteps had faded into the depths of the hall, Freydis knelt beside the broken toy. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Every line of the horse's body spoke of hours of careful work, of a father's love made manifest in wood and time. She could see where repairs had been made before, small imperfections that told of a treasured object repeatedly mended. "He made this for you?" she asked gently. Sigrid nodded, still not speaking. Her face had taken on the careful blankness that Freydis had seen on all the servants' faces, the expression of someone who had learned to hide their true feelings behind a mask of compliance. "Before Mama died," the child whispered. "Before Papa became angry all the time." The words hit Freydis like a physical blow. Suddenly, so much became clear: the hall's oppressive atmosphere, the servants' fearful silence, Einar's cold emptiness. This wasn't the home of a naturally cruel man. This was a place frozen in grief, trapped in the moment when joy had died along with someone deeply loved. "I can fix it," Freydis said softly, gathering the pieces of the horse. "It won't be the same as before, but it can be made whole again." Sigrid looked at her with eyes far too old for her young face. "Papa says broken things stay broken. He says it's better to throw them away than pretend they can be fixed." "Your papa has forgotten something important," Freydis replied, carefully collecting even the smallest fragments. "Sometimes the places where things break become the strongest parts. Sometimes being broken teaches us how to heal." That evening, by the light of her single candle, Freydis worked to repair the wooden horse. She had no proper tools, only a small knife from her healing kit and thread pulled from her own cloak, but she persevered. The head could be reattached with careful binding, the mane rewoven with new threads. It would bear scars, but it would run again. As she worked, she thought about the man who had carved this toy with such love and skill, and what terrible loss could have transformed him into the empty-eyed lord who had shattered it without hesitation. She thought about a little girl learning to hide her joy, and a household full of people who had forgotten what it felt like to laugh. When she finally set down the mended horse, she made herself a promise. She would find a way to heal more than just a broken toy. Somehow, she would find a way to heal the broken heart of this place, even if it meant risking everything she had left. The next morning, Freydis found Sigrid's repaired horse outside the child's chamber door before dawn. She heard no acknowledgement from within, but when she passed the alcove later that day, she glimpsed the little girl playing with the mended toy, running her small fingers over the visible seams where it had been broken and healed. Word of the confrontation had spread through the household like wildfire, though it was discussed only in whispers and meaningful glances. Some of the servants regarded Freydis with something approaching awe one had spoken back to the Jarl in living memory. Others looked at her with pity, certain that her days in the hall were numbered. But Einar made no move to dismiss her. Instead, he seemed to have forgotten her existence entirely, passing through the corridors with his usual cold silence while she went about her duties with careful efficiency. The only acknowledgement of their encounter was a subtle shifting in the household's atmosphere, a watchfulness, as if everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. It was Astrid who finally broke the tension 3 days later, approaching Freydis in the kitchen while she helped Ingrid prepare the evening meal. "The Jarl's sword needs tending," she said quietly, not meeting Freydis's eyes. "The leather wrapping on the hilt has been coming loose, and he mentioned it needs to be rewound properly." Freydis looked up from the vegetables she was chopping. "And you're telling me this because Olaf, who usually handles such things, has taken ill with a fever." Because you have steady hands and an eye for detail. Astrid paused, finally meeting her gaze. And because the Jarl specifically requested that you do it. The knife stilled in Freydis' hand. After days of being treated as if she were invisible, this felt like a test, though whether she was expected to pass or fail remained unclear. An hour later, she found herself in Einar's private chambers for the first time, carrying the sword that had been waiting for her in the armory. The room was spartanly furnished, a bed with heavy wooden posts, a chair placed before a cold hearth, a table covered with maps and correspondence. But it was the small details that caught her attention. A wooden cup worn smooth by use, a cloak, draped carefully over a chair as if its owner intended to return at any moment, a small tapestry hanging on the far wall that seemed out of place among the room's masculine austerity. The sword itself was a masterwork of craftsmanship, its blade bearing the subtle patterns that marked it as the work of a true artist. But the leather wrapping the hilt was indeed coming loose, and she could see where sweat and use had worn the binding thin dot she had just begun to unwrap. The old leather when Einar entered without warning. Freydis tensed, expecting another confrontation, but he simply moved to his table and began studying a map as if she weren't there. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft sounds of her work and the occasional rustle of parchment as he shifted the documents before him. But gradually, Freydis became aware that while he appeared to be absorbed in his correspondence, his attention was actually focused on her hands as she worked. "You have experience with weapons," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "My husband was a warrior," she replied without looking up from her task. "I learned to care for his gear. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. He died in a raid 3 summers ago. Fever took him on the journey home, not the glorious death in battle he'd always imagined." She felt rather than saw Einar's attention sharpen. "You speak of it without grief." "I grieved." Freydis' hands never paused in their careful work. "But grief is like a wound. It heals if you tend it properly, or festers if you ignore it. I chose to heal." The silence that followed was different from before, not empty, but weighted with unspoken thoughts. When Einar spoke again, his voice was softer, almost thoughtful. "Some wounds run too deep for healing." Freydis looked up then, meeting his gaze directly. "Some wounds run so deep that we convince ourselves they define us. We forget that we are more than our pain." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, a crack in the ice that covered deeper waters. But then, his expression closed off again, and he returned his attention to his maps with deliberate focus. "Tell me about your village," he said, clearly changing the subject. "What manner of scandal drives a healer into exile?" The question was asked casually, but Freydis sensed the weight behind it. This was what he really wanted to know, not her skill with weapons or leather, but the truth of what had brought her to his hall. "A young man took sick with a fever," she said carefully, still working on the sword hilt. "His mother brought him to me when the other healers could do nothing. I tended him for 3 days and nights, using every skill I possessed to break the fever. And you succeeded?" "I did." But when he woke, delirious and grateful, he spoke words of love and devotion. His mother heard them and decided that I had bewitched her son, used my position as a healer to seduce him while he was helpless. Freydis' hands tightened on the leather. The truth that a young man might mistake gratitude for love, might speak foolishly in his recovery, was less appealing than the story of a wicked widow who preyed on the vulnerable. "And what did you do when faced with these accusations?" "I tried to reason with them. I pointed out that the boy lived, that his fever had broken, that he was whole and healthy. But reason has little power against fear and suspicion." She finished, rewrapping the hilt, and held the sword out to him. "Sometimes people need someone to blame for things they don't understand. It's easier than accepting that sometimes bad things happen for no reason at all." Einar took the sword, testing the grip. of the new wrapping. His movements were economical and practiced, but Freydis noticed the way his thumb traced over a particular spot on the blade. A small nick near the crossguard that spoke of hard use and many battles. You defended yourself? I tried. But once. The accusations began. Every kindness was reinterpreted as manipulation. Every success as evidence of unnatural powers. The village turned against me because it was easier than confronting their own fears. So you ran. The words stung, but Freydis held his gaze steadily. I survived. Sometimes that requires strategic retreat rather than standing ground that cannot be held. Something in his expression shifted, not approval exactly, but a kind of recognition. A wise warrior knows when to yield the field. I am no warrior. Ah! You nod. He sheathed the sword with practiced ease. You stood against an entire village's judgment. You spoke truth when lies would have been safer. You defended a child's right to joy in a place where joy is forbidden. His eyes met hers again. If that is not warfare, what is? Before she could answer, he was moving toward the door, pausing only to add, "The leatherwork is well done. Olaf could learn from your technique." And then he was gone, leaving Freydis alone in his chamber with the scent of weapon oil and the lingering warmth of what might have been the first genuine conversation she'd had since arriving at the hall. In the days that followed her encounter with Einar in his chambers, Freydis noticed subtle changes in the hall's dynamics. The servants still moved with their characteristic caution, but there was less of the bone-deep tension that had marked her first week. More telling still, she began to catch glimpses of Sigrid playing with her mended horse in alcoves and corners. The child's movements less furtive than before, but not everyone welcomed these small shifts toward normalcy. "You're making waves," warned Gunnar, the household's senior servant and unofficial keeper of its customs. He was a thin, nervous man who had served the hall for nearly 2 decades, and change of any kind seemed to physically pain him. The Jarl values order above all things. Disruption, even small disruption, has consequences. They were in the storage rooms beneath the main hall, taking inventory of the winter supplies. Freydis had been assigned to help with the task, a sign of growing trust from Astrid, who managed such things with meticulous care. "I've disrupted nothing," Freydis replied mildly, marking down the number of ale barrels on her tally. "I've simply done the work assigned to me. Have you?" Gunnar's voice carried a sharp edge. "Because I've heard talk of healing salves appeared in the kitchen for Ingrid's burnt hand. I've heard that young Ericsson's fever broke after someone brought him tea made from herbs that don't grow in our garden. I've heard. You've heard that people are receiving care when they're hurt or sick." Freydis turned to face him fully. "Is this cause for concern in your mind?" "It's not my mind that concerns me," Gunnar shot back. "It's the Jarl's. He's made it clear that he wants no complications in his household. No attachments, no dependencies. No reasons for people to linger when they could be replaced." The last words hit their mark, and Freydis felt a chill run down her spine. "And you think showing basic kindness makes me a complication? I think you're forgetting why you're here." Gunnar moved closer, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "You're not here because you're special or gifted or needed. You're here because you had nowhere else to go, just like the 3 women before you. And you'll leave just like they did if you don't learn to keep your head down and your healing. Hands to yourself." Before Freydis could respond, the sound of footsteps on the stone stairs made them both turn. Einar descended into the storage area with his usual silent efficiency, his presence immediately transforming the atmosphere. Gunnar straightened as if jerked by invisible strings, his face taking on the bland mask of servile attention that she'd seen on every servant's face. "How goes the inventory?" Einar asked, his gaze moving from the ledger in Freydis' hands to the stacks of supplies around them. "Well, my lord," Gunnar replied quickly. "We have sufficient stores for the winter, though. We might need to purchase additional saltfish if the weather turns harsh early. Einar nodded, but his attention had shifted to Freydis. She was acutely aware of their earlier conversation, of the unexpected moment of connection she'd felt while tending his sword. Standing here in the dim storage room with Gunnar's warnings still echoing in her ears, that conversation felt like something that had happened to someone else. And you? Einar addressed her directly. What is your assessment of our preparations? The question caught her off guard. No one had asked for her opinion on household matters before. She was expected to follow orders, not offer insights. But something in his expression suggested that he genuinely wanted her answer. The dried herbs need attention, she said carefully. Some have lost their potency, and others show signs of mold. If someone falls ill this winter, half of what you have stored will be useless. Gunnar's intake of breath was audible, and she could practically feel his disapproval radiating from him like heat from a forge. But Einar simply nodded, as if her observation was perfectly reasonable. Show me, he said. The next hour was one of the strangest of Freydis' life. Under Einar's watchful eye, she sorted through the hall's medicinal supplies, separating the useful from the worthless, explaining the properties of various plants and their proper storage. He asked intelligent questions, listened to her answers with genuine attention, and even offered observations of his own based on his experience tending battlefield wounds. It was almost possible to forget, in those moments, that she was a servant, speaking to one of the most feared jarls in the north. The man examining dried willow bark with scholarly curiosity bore little resemblance to the cold lord who had smashed his daughter's toy horse in a fit of rage. You learned all this from your previous practice? He asked, turning a bundle of dried chamomile in his hands. Some of it. But much came from my grandmother. She was known throughout 3 villages for her healing skills. She taught me that plants are like people. They each have their own nature, their own strengths and weaknesses. Understanding them requires patience and observation. And what do your observations tell you about the people in this hall? The question was asked casually, but Freydis sensed deeper currents beneath it. Behind Einar, Gunnar had gone very still, clearly straining to hear her answer. I see people who have forgotten how to hope, she said carefully, who have learned to expect pain rather than comfort, suspicion rather than trust. They move through their days like wounded animals, always alert for the next blow. And what would you prescribe for such an ailment? There was something almost challenging in his tone, as if he were testing her somehow. Freydis chose her words with care. Time first. Wounds cannot be rushed in their healing. Then small consistencies, reliable kindness, predictable care. People need to feel safe before they can begin to trust again. Einar was quiet for a long moment, still turning the chamomile in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. And what of wounds that have been left untended too long, that have festered and poisoned everything around them? Even old wounds can heal, Freydis replied, meeting his gaze steadily. But the healing often requires cutting away the poison first, no matter how much it hurts. And it requires the wounded person to want to heal, to choose recovery over the familiar comfort of their pain. Something flickered in Einar's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or acknowledgement. But before he could respond, Gunnar cleared his throat meaningfully. My lord, if I may, the evening meal preparations will be beginning soon, and, of course. Einar set down the herbs and turned toward the stairs, but he paused at the bottom step, looking back at Freydis. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. I should have liked to meet her. She would have liked you too, Freydis said impulsively, then immediately wondered where the words had come from. Would she? There was genuine curiosity in his question. She believed that the hardest hearts often belonged to the most wounded souls. She had little patience for easy cruelty, but great compassion for those who had been hurt into hardness. For a moment, The years seemed to fall away from Einar's face, and she glimpsed the man he might have been before whatever tragedy had hollowed him out. Then the mask slipped back into place, and he was ascending the stairs without another word. But that evening, when Freydis brought him his customary cup of ale, she found a small wooden bowl beside his place at the high table. It was beautifully carved, its surface worn smooth by years of use, and it held a selection of the herbs they had sorted earlier, the good ones, properly stored and still potent. "For your work," he said, without looking up from his meal. "The hall's healing supplies are now your responsibility." It was a small thing perhaps, but as Freydis carried the bowl back to her chamber that night, she felt as if she'd been given far more than medicinal herbs. She'd been given trust, and with it, the first real hope she'd felt since arriving at the hall. Behind her, she could hear Gunnar muttering to the other servants about disruptions and complications, about the foolishness of growing attached to temporary arrangements. But for the first time since her exile, Freydis allowed herself to wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, she had found a place where her particular gifts might not only be tolerated, but needed. The first snows came early that year, blanketing the fjord in pristine white and driving the household into the closer quarters of winter living. The great hearth in the main hall burned constantly now, its warmth drawing people together in ways that the warmer months had not encouraged. It was during one of these long winter evenings that Freydis made her most significant discovery. She had been searching for additional wool in the upper chambers rooms that were rarely used now, but had once housed family members and honored guests. Most were empty save for dust and memories, but in one chamber, tucked away behind a heavy wooden chest, she found something that made her breath catch. It was a tapestry, exquisitely woven and still vibrant despite years of storage. The scene it depicted was one of domestic joy. A dark-haired man teaching a small boy to hold a sword while a golden-haired woman looked on with gentle laughter. A little girl played at their feet with a wooden horse, and in the background, the hall itself was shown in full celebration banners flying. People feasting, music, and dancing filling the great room. But it was the faces that struck her most deeply. The man bore Einar's features, but wore an expression of such unguarded happiness that she almost didn't recognize him. The woman was beautiful in the way that suggested inner light rather than mere physical perfection, and the children, clearly. A young Sigrid and an older brother glowed with the simple joy of being loved unconditionally. "You shouldn't be in here." The voice behind her made Freydis spin around, her heart hammering. Einar stood in the doorway, but for once his presence didn't fill the space with its usual cold authority. Instead, he looked somehow diminished, as if the tapestry had stolen something vital from him. "I was looking for wool for the winter spinning," she said quickly. "Astrid said there might be stores in the upper chambers. I didn't mean to pry, but you did pry." He stepped into the room, his gaze fixed on the tapestry. "And now you've found what I came here to forget." The pain in his voice was so raw that Freydis felt it like a physical blow. This wasn't the controlled emptiness she'd grown accustomed to. This was grief laid bare, all the more devastating for being witnessed. "Your family," she said softly. It wasn't a question. "My family." He moved closer to the tapestry, reaching out to touch the woven image of the golden-haired woman. "Astrid made this during our first winter as a married couple. She said she wanted to capture the happiness, to have something beautiful to look at during the dark months." "Astrid, your wife was named Astrid? Is that why you flinch sometimes when our Astrid speaks to you? Because the name carries memories?" Einar's hand dropped to his side. "Everything in this place carries memories. That's why I should have burned it all years ago, started fresh somewhere else. But I couldn't leave. This hall holds the only happiness I've ever known, even if it also holds the greatest pain." Freydis studied the tapestry again, understanding now why it had been hidden away. "What happened to them?" "Plague." The word fell like a stone into still water, 3 winters ago. It came with a trading ship from the southern lands, spread through the village like wildfire. My son Bjorn was the first to sicken, then Astrid herself. I could have fled, other Jarls abandoned their holdings to escape the contagion. But they were my people, my responsibility. You stayed. I stayed, and I watched half my hall die in agony while I remained untouched. The gods, it seems, have a sense of irony. They spared the one person who would have gladly taken their place. The bitterness in his voice was corrosive, eating at the air between them. Freydis found herself, taking a step closer, drawn by an instinct she couldn't name. And Sigrid? Sigrid survived, though she was ill for weeks. I hoped that having her would be enough, that I could learn to live for her sake alone. But grief is a selfish master. The more I tried to protect her from pain, the more I stole her joy. The more I tried to prepare her for loss, the more I ensured she would know nothing else. So you broke her toy horse to teach her that beautiful things don't last. I broke her toy horse because seeing her happy terrified me more than seeing her sad. He turned away from the tapestry, facing her directly. Because happiness is a promise that the world delights in breaking, and I couldn't bear to watch her heart shatter the way mine did. The honesty of the admission left Freydis momentarily speechless. In her years as a healer, she'd encountered grief in many forms, but rarely had she seen it expressed with such stark self-awareness. But now she has no joy and no hope, she said gently. You've protected her from future heartbreak by ensuring she lives in a perpetual state of loss. Better that than... He stopped himself, running a hand through his dark hair. You think me cruel? I think you're terrified. And I think your daughter is paying the price for your fear. The silence that followed was charged with tension, but it wasn't the cold emptiness she'd grown accustomed to. This was the crackling electricity that comes before a storm breaks. What would you have me do? He asked finally. Pretend that loss isn't inevitable? Teach her to love deeply, knowing that everything she loves will eventually be taken from her? I would have you teach her that love is worth the risk of loss. That joy, however brief, is better than safety bought with sorrow. Freydis moved too. Stand beside him, both of them now facing the tapestry. Your wife, she knew she might lose you every time you went to battle. Did that knowledge make her love you less? No, he admitted quietly. If anything, it made every moment more precious. Then why deny your daughter the same choice? Why decide for her that love is too dangerous to risk? Einar was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the woven image of his family's happiness. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, because I don't know how to live with that much hope again. Hope requires courage I no longer possess. Then perhaps, Freydis said carefully, you might start by allowing someone else to hope for you, until you remember how. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something shift in his expression. Not the sudden crack of ice she'd glimpsed before, but a slow thawing, like snow beginning to melt at winter's end. And would you take on such a foolish task? The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither was quite ready to acknowledge. But as Freydis met his gaze in the dim light of the storage chamber, surrounded by the echoes of lost happiness and the possibility of something new, she found her answer coming from a place deeper than conscious thought. Yes, she said simply. I would. In the weeks that followed their encounter in the upper chamber, something fundamental shifted in the hall's atmosphere. It began with small things, Einar's nods of acknowledgement when Freydis passed him in the corridors, his questions about the household's health and well-being, the way his presence no longer sent servants scurrying like mice before a cat. More significantly, Sigrid began to emerge from the shadows where she'd learned to hide. Freydis would catch glimpses of the child playing with her mended horse, and increasingly, she would see Einar pause to watch his daughter with an expression that was slowly warming from resignation to something, approaching wonder, but change. Even positive change rarely goes unnoticed by those who profit from the status quo. "Riders approaching from the south," announced Tormund, one of the hall's guards, as he burst through the great doors on a particularly bitter morning. 3. Men under Jarl Olsen's banner. The news sent a ripple of tension through the assembled household. Jarl Olsen was Einar's nearest neighbor and, by most accounts, his greatest rival. Their relationship had always been complicated, bound by necessity and mutual respect, but strained by old grievances and competing interests. Einar rose from the high table where he'd been breaking his fast, his expression immediately hardening into the mask of cold authority that Freydis had thought was beginning to thaw. "Prepare the guest chambers," he ordered, "and send word to the kitchen we'll feast tonight, whatever their business." As the household burst into activity, Freydis found herself helping Astrid prepare one of the guest chambers. The older woman worked with unusual tension, her movements sharp and efficient. "You're worried," Freydis observed, shaking out fresh bedding. "Olsen doesn't make social calls, especially not in winter. If he's here, it's because he wants something or because he's heard something that concerns him. Such as..." Astrid paused in her work, meeting Freydis' eyes with an expression full of meaning. "Such as rumors that our Jarl has been growing soft, that his household has become a place of comfort rather than discipline, that he's been influenced by..." She stopped herself, but the implication was clear. "By a certain servant woman with questionable loyalties and a talent for disruption." "You said it, not I." But Astrid's tone wasn't unkind. "Be careful tonight, Freydis. Men like Olsen see change as weakness, and they have long memories for perceived slights." That evening, the great hall was transformed. Banners hung from the rafters. Extra tables were brought out to accommodate the visitors and their retinue, and the best ale and mead flowed freely. But beneath the facade of hospitality, Freydis could sense the undercurrents of tension. Jarl Olsen was a man in his middle years, thick-bodied and loud-voiced, with the kind of aggressive joviality that often masked calculation. His companions were younger, his sons, perhaps, or trusted war leaders, and they carried themselves with the casual arrogance of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. "Einar, my friend," Olsen boomed as he was ushered to a place of honor at the high table. "How long has it been?" "Too long, surely. Your hall looks prosperous, peaceful." "Perhaps too peaceful for a warrior of your reputation?" The words were spoken with a laugh, but Freydis caught the edge beneath them. This was a testing, a probing for weakness. "Peace is a luxury I've earned," Einar replied evenly. "My battles have been fought, my victories won. I see no shame in enjoying the fruits of past labor. Ah, but past victories grow stale, don't they? And young warriors are always eager to test themselves against legendary names." Olsen's gaze swept the hall, taking in the relaxed atmosphere, the servants who moved without obvious fear. "I've heard interesting tales of late stories of your household's transformation. Have you? And what tales might those be?" Freydis, serving ale at a nearby table, felt herself go still. She could see where this conversation was heading, and the knowledge filled her with cold dread. "Oh, nothing too specific. Traders gossip mostly. Talk of a certain woman who's found shelter in your hall, a woman with an interesting past. Freydis, daughter of Thorvald, isn't it?" The hall seemed to hold its breath. Freydis felt every eye turned toward her, though she kept her gaze fixed on the pitcher in her hands. At the high table, Einar had gone very still. "I employ many servants," he said carefully. "I don't make it my practice to interrogate them about their histories." Of course not. Of course not. But when that history includes accusations of seduction and witchcraft, well, a man does wonder what sort of influence such a person might have in a household, especially when that household shows such marked changes from its former ... discipline. Are you questioning my judgment, Olsen?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. This was the Einar that Freydis recognized from her first days in the hall cold. Dangerous, radiating the promise of violence. But Olsen was either too drunk or too confident to recognize the warning signs. Not questioning, merely observing. You've always been known for your strength, your uncompromising nature. Some might say these recent ... softenings could be seen as weakness by those who might wish to test your resolve. And would you be among those seeking to test my resolve? The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Around the hall, hands drifted casually toward weapon hilts, and Freydis realized that what had seemed like a social visit was rapidly becoming something far more dangerous. It was then that Sigrid appeared at Freydis' side, moving with the silent grace she'd learned in a household where children were expected to be invisible. In her small hands, she carried her wooden horse, the toy that Einar had broken and Freydis had mended. "Papa carved this for me," she said, her clear voice carrying across the suddenly quiet hall. "It broke, but Freydis fixed it. She says broken things can become stronger at the places where they heal." The simplicity of the child's words seemed to cut through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. Freydis watched as Einar's expression softened as he looked at his daughter, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years. "That's a beautiful horse," he said gently, reaching down to touch the carved mane. And wise words from someone very small. Freydis is wise. Words about many things, Sigrid continued, apparently oblivious to the adult drama swirling around her. "She says that being strong doesn't mean being alone, and that taking care of people isn't weakness. It's what makes someone worth following." Olsen's face had taken on a mottled red color. Whether from embarrassment or anger, Freydis couldn't tell. But before he could respond, Einar stood, lifting his daughter into his arms with gentle care. "My daughter speaks truly," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Strength that cannot bend will surely break. And a leader who cannot inspire loyalty through care will find himself commanding only through fear, a brittle foundation for any lasting power." His gaze moved to Freydis then, and in his eyes she saw something that made her breath catch, not just gratitude, but recognition. In that moment, she realized that whatever had been building between them had crystallized into something neither could deny. The silver pendant at his throat caught the firelight as he turned back to Olsen, and Freydis noticed for the first time that it bore the same intricate knotwork pattern as the one in the tapestry, his wife's pendant, worn close to his heart all these years. "Now then," Einar continued, settling Sigrid on his lap, "shall we speak plainly about why you've really come to my hall?" The morning after Olsen's departure brought with it an atmosphere of fragile hope. The confrontation at the feast had ended, without bloodshed, with Olsen grudgingly accepting Einar's pointed questions about his own motivations and leaving with fewer answers than he'd hoped to gain. But more importantly, it had marked a turning point in how the household viewed both their lord and the woman who had somehow catalyzed his transformation. Freydis was tending to her herbs in the small garden she'd established behind the kitchen, when Tormund approached with an expression of barely contained urgency. "There's a messenger at the gate," he said without preamble. "He bears your family's colors and asks to speak with you privately. The Jarl says you're to meet with him, but..." The young guard hesitated. "He seems troubled, this messenger. More than travel-weary." A cold knot formed in Freydis' stomach. She had no family left who would send messengers, no one from her past who would seek her out in this remote place. With growing dread, she made her way to the small chamber where visitors were received, Tormund trailing behind with obvious concern. The man waiting for her was indeed travel-stained and exhausted, but she recognized him despite the years that had passed. Magnus had been her late husband's sworn companion, a man she'd last seen at the funeral pyre 3 summers ago. "Magnus?" She closed the door behind her, noting how Tormund positioned himself just outside, close enough to respond to trouble. far enough to allow privacy. What brings you to this distant place? Necessity, he replied grimly, rising from his chair. And news that couldn't wait for better times or safer roads. He reached into his travel pack and withdrew a letter, its wax seal broken, the parchment bearing the stains of hard travel. This came to the village a fortnight ago, carried by a trader from the eastern settlements. It concerns the reason for your exile. Freydis felt the blood drain from her face. Magnus, that matter is closed. I found peace here, found. Read. It, he interrupted, pressing the letter into her hands. The truth has a way of surfacing, even when buried under lies and fear. With trembling fingers, Freydis unfolded the parchment. The words were written in a careful hand, each letter formed with the precision of someone unaccustomed to writing but determined to be clear. To any who might carry word to the healer Freydis, daughter of Thorvald. I am born Eriksson, son of Eric the merchant. 3 years passed. I fell ill with a fever that should have claimed my life. The healer Freydis tended me through the dark days, using skills that saved me when all others had given up hope. In my delirium, I spoke words of gratitude that my mother chose to interpret as evidence of seduction and witchcraft. I have carried this lie on my conscience ever since, knowing that my cowardice in not speaking the truth led to an innocent woman's exile. I write now because I am dying, a wasting sickness that no healer can cure, and I would not meet my ancestors with this deception on my soul. Freydis is innocent of all charges brought against her. She is a healer of great skill and perfect honor, and any who question this do so from ignorance or malice. Let this testimony stand as truth, witnessed by my own hand and sealed with my blood. May the gods forgive me for waiting so long to speak. The letter fell from Freydis' nerveless fingers. For a moment, the room seemed to spin around her, years of shame and self-doubt colliding with the stark relief of vindication. He's dead then? She asked quietly. 3 days after he dictated that letter to the village scribe. The sickness took him quickly at the end, but he lingered long enough to make sure this reached the right hands. Magnus bent to retrieve the fallen parchment. There's more, though. Word of this confession has spread. Your former neighbors are divided in their response. Divided how? Some feel shame at their treatment of you. Others claim that dying men often speak falsely to ease their passage to the next world. And a few, Magnus hesitated. A few blame you for bewitching the boy even unto death, saying that his confession proves your power over him. Freydis sank into the chair Magnus had vacated, her mind reeling. So I'm vindicated and more reviled than ever, all at once. Not all reviled. There are those who remember your good works, who are prepared to welcome you back if you choose to return. The village needs healers, and the truth of your innocence has given courage to those who always believed in you. Return. The word felt foreign on her tongue. For months, exile had been her reality, and she built a new life within its constraints. The possibility of reclaiming her old existence seemed both impossible and oddly unappealing. You don't seem pleased by the prospect, Magnus observed. Before she could answer, a soft knock interrupted them. At her call to enter, Einar stepped through the door, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes alert to any sign of distress. Forgive the interruption, he said formally, though his gaze was fixed on Freydis' face. Tormund mentioned that you received troubling news. Magnus rose and bowed with the respect due to a Jarl. My lord, I am Magnus Olafsson, once companion to Freydis' late husband. I bring word from her former village. What manner of word? Freydis found her voice. At last, vindication, she said, the word bitter on her tongue. The young man whose supposed seduction led to my exile has confessed on his deathbed that I am innocent of all charges. Einar's expression didn't change, but she saw something flicker in his eyes, relief, perhaps, or satisfaction. Then you are free to return to your former life with honor restored. The careful neutrality of his tone struck her like a physical blow. After weeks of growing closeness, of shared confidences and mutual support, he was suddenly speaking to her as if she were indeed just a servant who might be dismissed at any moment. "My lord offers to help with travel arrangements," Magnus said, misreading the silence. "The village council has voted to restore your property and position, and there are many who would welcome your return." "How generous," Freydis said quietly, her eyes never leaving Einar's face. "To be welcomed back to the place that cast me out, to resume the life that was stolen from me through fear and superstition. It's what you wanted, isn't it?" Einar asked, his voice still that careful, neutral tone. "To clear your name, to return to where you belong." The question hung in the air between them, weighted with all the things they'd shared and all the things they'd left unspoken. Freydis realized that this was a test of sorts, not of her loyalty or her feelings, but of his own courage. He was offering her freedom because he believed it was what she deserved, but he was afraid to ask her to stay because he couldn't bear another rejection, another loss. "What I want," she said carefully, "is to be where I'm needed, where my skills are valued and my presence makes a difference." "Then you should go," Einar replied, but there was pain beneath the stoic words. "Your village needs healers, and you have ties there that go back generations. Here you are." He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "Here you are, wasted on tasks any servant could perform." Magnus, clearly sensing undercurrents he didn't understand, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Perhaps you need time to consider? I can remain a few days while you decide." "No," Freydis said, her decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. "I don't need time to consider." She stood, moving to where Einar stood rigid as stone. "I know exactly where I belong." She reached up and touched the silver pendant at his throat, his wife's pendant, worn faithfully all these years as a symbol of love that transcended death. "This belonged to someone who chose love over safety," she said softly. "Who risked her heart knowing that warriors die young and happiness is never guaranteed. Would you dishonor her memory by choosing fear over the possibility of joy?" Einar's careful composure finally cracked. "Freydis, I'm not her," she continued. "I can't replace what you lost, and I wouldn't try to. But I can offer what I am, a woman who's learned that home isn't a place you're born to, but a place you choose to build. I choose to build it here, with you, if you'll have me." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Then Einar's hand covered hers, where it rested against the pendant, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Stay," he said simply. "Please stay." Magnus coughed diplomatically. "I take it your answer to the village council will be no?" Freydis smiled, the first genuinely happy expression she'd worn since receiving the letter. "Tell them I've found where I belong. And tell them that sometimes the greatest healing happens not in returning to what was broken, but in building something entirely new." The days following Magnus's departure were filled with a strange, nervous energy that seemed to permeate every corner of the hall. Word of Freydis' vindication had spread quickly among the servants, and with it came a shift in how she was perceived. No longer was she the mysterious exile whose past was whispered about in dark corners. She was now a woman who had chosen to stay when she could have left, who had found belonging in a place that others had fled. But with this new acceptance came new challenges. "The other Jarls will hear of this," Astrid warned one morning as she and Freydis worked together in the weaving room. "Olsen's visit was just the beginning. They'll see the changes here, see how our Lord's demeanor has softened, and they'll probe for weakness." "And do you think they'll find it?" Freydis asked, her hand steady on the loom despite the concern in her voice. "I think they'll find something they don't understand, and that will make them dangerous." Astrid's voice carried the weight of long experience. Fear of the unknown drives men to do terrible things, especially when their own power feels threatened. As if summoned by their conversation, Tormund appeared in the doorway with the tense expression that had become all too familiar. "Riders," he announced, more than before. "Jarl Olsen returns, but this time he brings Jarl Hedrick and Jarl Sven with him. 20 men at least, all armed." The blood drained from Freydis' face. 3 Jarls traveling together meant only one thing: they had formed an alliance, and their combined forces represented a serious threat to Einar's hold on his lands. "Where is the Jarl?" Astrid asked, already rising from her work. "In the armory with the men, preparing for whatever this visit might bring. He's asked that all non-essential personnel be kept away from the Great Hall until after the meeting." "Non-essential," Freydis repeated with bitter understanding. "Meaning me?" "Meaning anyone they might use as leverage," Tormund corrected gently. "Your presence here has become symbolic, whether you intended it or not. To them, you represent everything they fear about change and weakness." That evening, as the hall prepared to receive its unwelcome visitors, Einar sought out Freydis in her chamber. He wore his finest clothing, a tunic of deep blue wool embroidered with silver threads. His best cloak clasped with brooch that spoke of wealth and status. But it was the silver arm ring on his right wrist that caught her attention. She had never seen him wear it before, and its presence now felt significant. "You look like a Jarl," she said softly, trying to keep her voice light despite the gravity of the situation. "I am a Jarl," he replied, but there was weariness in his voice. "Though I sometimes forget that the title comes with obligations I'd rather avoid." He moved to her small window, gazing out at the torches that marked the approach of their visitors. In the flickering light, his profile looked carved from stone, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand kept moving to rest on his sword hilt. "They've come to test you," she said, joining him at the window. "They've come to test us," he corrected. "Everything that's changed here, everything that's grown better and stronger. They see it as corruption, as evidence that I've lost the edge that made me dangerous. And have you?" He turned to face her then, and she saw not the cold lord she'd first encountered, but a man who had learned to hope again, who had remembered what it meant to care for others. "I've changed," he said simply. "Whether that makes me weaker or stronger remains to be seen. You know what they'll demand. They'll demand proof that I haven't gone soft. They'll want to see the old Einar, the one who ruled through fear and solved problems with violence." His voice was quiet, but she could hear the steel beneath it. "And they'll likely demand that I remove the source of my supposed corruption." The words hung between them like a blade. Freydis had known this moment would come, had understood from the beginning that her presence in the hall would eventually draw challenge and consequence. "I could leave," she offered, "if my being here threatens everything you've built." "No." The word came out sharp and absolute. "I've spent 3 years hiding from life, convincing myself that emptiness was strength and isolation was safety. I won't go back to that existence, not even to appease men who mistake cruelty for leadership." He reached for the silver arm ring on his wrist, working it free with careful movements. The metal caught the candlelight as he held it out to her, and she could see the intricate knotwork carved into its surface, the same pattern that appeared on his pendant. His wife's pendant. "This belonged to my father, and his father before him. It's a symbol of authority, yes, but also of commitment to the people under my protection, to the values I choose to uphold." He took her hand and placed the ring in her palm, closing her fingers around the warm metal. "I want you to have it." "Einar, I can't." "You can, and you will. Not as a servant or even as a lover, but as the partner I should have reckoned to you, as from the beginning." His hands covered hers around the ring. "Whatever happens tonight, I want them to see that I make my own choices about what gives my life meaning." The weight of the silver band seemed to pulse with significance. This wasn't just jewelry. It was a declaration, a public statement that would leave no doubt about where Einar's loyalties lay. "They'll see this as a provocation," she warned. Let them. I'm tired of making decisions based on other men's fears and prejudices. He lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Will you wear it tonight? Will you stand beside me when they come? The question carried implications far beyond the immediate crisis. To wear his ring, to appear at his side during such a confrontation, would mark her permanently as his chosen partner. There would be no going back, no retreat into the shadows of servitude. Yes, she said without hesitation. I'll stand with you. The silver ring slipped onto her finger as if it had been made for her, and as Einar's arms came around her, Freydis felt a deep sense of rightness settle over her. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. An hour later, the great hall had been transformed into something resembling a war council. The 3 visiting Jarls sat at places of honor, their retinues arranged behind them in a display of barely contained menace. Einar's own men flanked the walls, hands resting casually on weapon hilts, their loyalty evident in their positioning. But it was Freydis' entrance that caused the greatest stir. She wore her finest dress, a deep green wool that brought out the color of her eyes, and Einar's arm ring gleamed silver on her finger. More significantly, she took her place not among the servants along the walls, but in a chair that had been placed beside Einar's own seat at the high table. The message was unmistakable, and the reaction was immediate. So, Jarl Olsen said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet hall, the rumors proved true. You elevate a servant to sit as your equal. I elevate a woman of worth to her proper place, Einar replied calmly. Though I understand, such concepts might be foreign to men who measure value only in gold and blood. Jarl Hedrick, a scarred veteran with cold eyes, leaned forward in his chair. Pretty words, Einar, but we didn't ride through winter storms for a philosophy lesson. We came because your neighbors grow concerned about your stability. My stability? Your weakness, Jarl Sven interjected bluntly. He was the youngest of the 3, perhaps 40 winters, with the hungry look of a man eager to prove himself. This hall once struck fear into the hearts of enemies across 3 provinces. Now it's become a refuge for outcasts and a showcase for domestic tranquility. And you find fault with peace? We find fault with the illusion of peace, Hedrick corrected. Your enemies haven't disappeared, Einar. They've simply been waiting for you to show vulnerability. And what greater vulnerability could there be than a Jarl who places his heart in the hands of a woman with a history of beguiling men? The insult hung in the air like poison, but before Einar could respond, Freydis spoke for herself. I see my reputation has traveled even further than I thought, she said, her voice carrying a note of dry amusement. Tell me, Jarl Hedrikin, your version of this tale. Exactly how did I manage to beguile a dying fever victim? Did I use my healing skills to make him more susceptible to seduction? Did I perhaps bewitch his medicine? The unexpected directness of her response seemed to catch the visiting Jarls off guard. They had clearly expected either cowering silence or defensive protests, not this calm dismantling of their accusations. Mock the charges if you will, Sven said, recovering first, but the boy's deathbed confession proves nothing. Dying men say many things to ease their guilt. Indeed they do, Freydis agreed, just as living men say many things to justify their fears. The question is which category your concerns fall into. Enough wordplay, Olsen interrupted, clearly annoyed at having lost control of the conversation. We didn't come here to debate the woman's past. We came because Einar's transformation concerns those who once counted him as an ally. And what precisely concerns you? Einar asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. Your softness, Hedrick replied bluntly. Your servants no longer fear you. Your household has become a place of comfort rather than discipline. You consult with a woman before making decisions that affect the security of this region. I consult with a trusted advisor whose judgment has proven sound. Einar corrected. Would you rather I make decisions in isolation, like a madman talking to shadows? We would rather you make decisions like the warrior you once were, Sven shot back. Hard decisions that put strength before sentiment, survival before comfort. And if those decisions require cruelty, if they demand the sacrifice of everything that makes life worth living, then you make them anyway, Olsen said, with finality, because the alternative is weakness, and weakness invites conquest. Your enemies aren't interested in your personal happiness, Einar. They're interested in your lands, your resources, your strategic position. And they're waiting for the first sign that you've lost the edge that once made you untouchable. The three Jarls exchanged glances, and Freydis realized they had reached the moment she'd been dreading. This had been building toward an ultimatum, and now it was about to be delivered. So we come to you as neighbors and allies, Hedrick continued, with an offer of support and guidance. Restore the discipline that once made this hall feared. Remove the influences that have softened your resolve. Return to the practices that served you well in darker times. And if I refuse, then you face the future alone, Sven said simply. No mutual defense pacts, no shared intelligence about enemy movements, no coordinated responses to threats. You'll have your domestic tranquility, but you'll have it in isolation until someone stronger decides to take it from you. The threat was clear, and as Freydis looked around the hall, she could see the fear it generated in the faces of Einar's people. They had grown accustomed to safety, to the possibility of happiness, and now they were being told that such luxuries came at the price of vulnerability. But when she looked at Einar, she saw not fear but determination. His hand found hers under the table, his fingers intertwining with hers around the silver ring that marked their bond. I understand your concerns, he said finally, his voice carrying throughout the silent hall, and I thank you for your offer of guidance. But I must respectfully decline. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of tension throughout the room. Then you've made your choice, Olsen said, rising from his chair. Pray to whatever gods still listen that you don't come to regret it. As the three Jarls and their retinues prepared to depart, Freydis felt the weight of what they had just committed to. They had chosen love over security, hope over fear, but the consequences of that choice would be tested in the days to come. Are you afraid? Einar asked quietly as they watched their unwelcome visitors disappear into the winter night. Terrified, she admitted, but not of them. I'm afraid of losing what we've built here, what we've found together. Then we'll have to make sure that doesn't happen, he said, pulling her close. Whatever comes next, we face it together. The silver ring on her finger caught the firelight as she nodded, and in that moment, Freydis knew that whatever trials lay ahead, they had something their enemies lacked, the strength that comes from choosing to fight not just for survival, but for the right to hope. The attack came at dawn, 3 days after the Jarl's departure. Freydis woke to the sound of war horns echoing across the fjord, their deep voices carrying news that every soul in the hall had been dreading. From her chamber window, she could see the ships, too many ships, their dragon-headed prows cutting through the morning mist like predators scenting blood. How many? She asked Tormund, who had burst through her door without ceremony. 20 vessels at least, flying colors. I don't recognize. They're not local. Someone has hired mercenaries. His young face was pale but determined. The Jarl wants all non-combatants in the Great Hall's lower chambers. The stone walls are thickest there. But even as he spoke, Freydis was reaching for her healing pouch and the wooden chest that held her medical supplies. I won't cower in a cellar while people bleed and die above me. Freydis, you can't. I can, and I will. She turned to face him, and he stepped back at the fierce resolve. In her eyes, I'm not a warrior, but I am a healer. My place is wherever I'm needed most. The Great Hall had been transformed into a fortress, its windows barricaded, its entrances reinforced with whatever materials could be found. The huge hearth fire burned bright in the center, casting dancing shadows on the walls and providing both warmth and light for the defenders. Around it, the household had gathered, not just the warriors, but everyone who called this place home. Einar stood near the fire, his armor gleaming in the firelight, his sword at his side. But it was his face that struck Freydis most powerfully. Gone was any trace of the cold, empty lord she'd first encountered. This was a man fighting for something he valued, and that made all the difference. "The ships are beaching now," reported one of his scouts. "Professional soldiers, well-armed and disciplined. But they're not moving to immediate attack. They're forming ranks, waiting for something." "For what?" Astrid asked. She had refused to retreat to the lower chambers as well, instead organizing the other women to prepare bandages and boil water for treating wounds. Her answer came in the form of a single rider approaching under a white banner. Through the barricaded windows, they could see him dismount and walk toward the hall's main entrance, his message clearly intended for all to hear. "Einar, called Jarl of these lands," the herald called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "I bring terms from those who would see justice done and proper order restored." "Let him speak," Einar called back, though his hand never left his sword hilt. "Surrender the woman called Freydis, she who has corrupted your judgment and weakened your resolve. Do this, and the forces arrayed against you will withdraw in peace. Refuse, and this hall will burn with all who shelter within it." The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye in the hall turned toward Freydis, and she felt the weight of their collective fear. These people, servants and warriors alike, had become her family, and now their lives hung in the balance because of her presence. "How long do we have to consider?" she called out, surprising everyone, including herself. "Until the sun reaches its peak," came the reply. "No longer." As the herald rode away, the hall erupted in urgent conversation. Some voices called for defiance, others for negotiation, and a few, though they spoke quietly, suggested that perhaps one life wasn't worth risking so many. "Silence," Einar commanded, and the room immediately stilled. "There will be no discussion of surrender. This hall is our home, and we don't hand over family members to appease bullies and cowards." "But my lord," ventured one of the older servants, "if her leaving would save the rest of us." "It wouldn't," Freydis interrupted, moving to stand beside Einar. "Can't you see? This isn't really about me. I'm just the excuse they're using to challenge everything that's changed here. If they remove me and Einar returns to his old ways, they've proven that transformation is impossible, that hope is foolishness." She looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of people who had become dear to her. Astrid with her quiet wisdom, Ingrid with her practical kindness, young Tormund with his earnest loyalty, and little Sigrid, who clutched her mended wooden horse as if it were a talisman. "But if we stand together," she continued, "if we show them that people can choose love over fear, healing over harm, then we prove something that threatens their entire worldview. We prove that strength doesn't require cruelty, that leadership doesn't demand isolation." "Pretty words," muttered Gunnar, who had remained skeptical of the changes despite their obvious benefits. "But words don't stop swords or shield us from fire." "No," Einar agreed, stepping forward so that he and Freydis stood united before the assembled household. "But conviction does. Purpose does. The knowledge that we fight not just for survival, but for the right to live as human beings rather than frightened animals." He raised his voice so that it carried to every corner of the hall. "I won't lie to you, the odds are not in our favor. The men outside are professionals, and they outnumber us significantly. But they fight for gold and the promises of distant jarls. We fight for our home, our family, our future." His gaze moved to Freydis, and in his eyes she saw not just love, but absolute certainty. "And that," he concluded, "makes all the difference." The battle, when it came, was nothing like the glorious conflicts sung about in halls and celebrated in stories. It was brutal, desperate, and intimate, a clash of wills as much as weapons, fought in corridors and chambers where every defender knew exactly what they were protecting. The attackers came at midday as promised, but their assault revealed something unexpected. These weren't the mindless berserkers of legend, nor were they the disciplined professionals the scout had reported. As the first wave broke against the hall's defenses, Freydis realized with growing understanding that many of the attacking force were fighting reluctantly, driven more by obligation than enthusiasm. "They're not unified," she called to Einar during a brief lull in the fighting. "Look at their movements. The mercenaries press the attack, but the others hold back." She was right. Through the smoke and chaos, it became clear that the force arrayed against them was composed of multiple factions, each with their own motivations and levels of commitment. The hired warriors fought with professional skill, but no personal investment, while the men flying the banners of neighboring jarls seemed increasingly hesitant as the cost of the assault mounted. It was then that Freydis made a decision that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. Setting aside her healing supplies, she moved toward the main entrance, where the heaviest fighting was taking place. "What are you doing?" Astrid called after her. "Something that might end this without more bloodshed," Freydis replied, though. Her voice shook with fear of what she was contemplating. Before anyone could stop her, she had unbarred the great doors and stepped out into the courtyard. The fighting slowed, then stopped entirely as both sides stared in amazement at the sight of the woman they'd come to claim walking directly into their midst. "I am Freydis, daughter of Thorvald," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "I'm told you've come for me." A murmur ran through the attacking force, and she could see the uncertainty in their faces. This wasn't how such confrontations were supposed to unfold. The prize wasn't supposed to present itself voluntarily. "I offer you a different bargain," she continued, raising her voice so that everyone could hear. "I'll come with you willingly, but first, you must hear the truth of why you're really here." One of the mercenary commanders stepped forward, his sword still drawn but held at a less threatening angle. "Speak quickly, woman. We have our orders. And who gave you those orders? Was it Jarl Olsen, concerned about his neighbor's military preparedness? Was it Jarl Hedrick, worried about regional stability? Or was it men who fear that if one lord can rule through respect rather than terror, others might follow his example?" The question struck home. She could see it in the way some of the attackers exchanged glances, in the subtle shift of posture that spoke of growing doubt. "You've been told I'm a witch who corrupted a good man," she pressed on. "But look around. Do you see evidence of corruption? Do you see a hall weakened by kindness or strengthened by loyalty? Do you see people who fight reluctantly from fear or willingly from love?" Behind her, she could hear the defenders emerging from the hall, not in surrender, but in support. Einar appeared at her side, his presence both reassuring and terrifying in its implications. If this went wrong, they would face the consequences together. "The woman speaks truly," he said, his voice carrying the authority of long command. "You were told you came to remove a corrupting influence. But the real corruption is the belief that strength requires cruelty, that leadership demands the sacrifice of our humanity." "Pretty speeches," one of the hired warriors sneered, though his tone lacked conviction. "But we have contracts to fulfill. Contracts paid for by men who profit from keeping others in fear." Freydis shot back. "How much gold is your honor worth? How much silver will it take to make you proud of burning a home filled with families?" The attack that resumed was half-hearted, fragmenting as individual warriors made their own choices about what they were willing to do. The mercenaries pressed forward with professional determination, but they found themselves increasingly isolated. As their supposed allies began to withdraw, it was little Sigrid who provided the final turning point. The child appeared at the hall's entrance, her wooden horse clutched in her small hands, and her clear voice cut through the sounds of combat. "Why are you trying to hurt my father?" she called out, her words carrying an innocence that stopped hardened warriors in their tracks. "He's not mean anymore. He smiles now, and he plays with me sometimes. Why do you want to make him sad again?" The simplicity of the question, the pure, uncomprehending confusion of a child who couldn't understand why anyone would want to destroy happiness, broke something in the attacking force. One by one, weapons were lowered, steps were taken backward, and what had begun as an assault became a reluctant withdrawal. The mercenary commander looked around at his fragmenting forces, then back at Freydis and Einar standing united before their hall. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "No," Einar agreed quietly, "but today it is." As the last of the attackers boarded their ships and disappeared into the afternoon mist, Freydis felt Einar's arms come around her from behind. They had won, but more importantly, they had won without becoming the very thing their enemies claimed to fear. "Was that wisdom or madness?" he asked softly. "Perhaps both," she replied, leaning back against his strength. "But it was our choice to make." Spring came early that year, as if the very earth was eager to celebrate the hall's survival and transformation. The ice broke from the fjord with thunderous cracks that echoed like applause, and the first green shoots appeared in Freydis' herb garden weeks before anyone expected them. She was tending those tender plants when Astrid approached with news that made her heart leap with joy and trepidation in equal measure. "A messenger has arrived," the older woman said, her face bright with barely contained excitement. "From Jarl Magnus of the Eastern Settlements. He wishes to discuss a marriage alliance, not through conquest or politics, but through genuine partnership." Freydis set down her trowel, brushing soil from her hands as she considered the implications. Word of their victory had spread throughout the northern lands, but not as a tale of military triumph. Instead, it had become something far more powerful, a story of transformation, of the strength that comes from choosing love over fear. "Others have been asking questions, too," Astrid continued. "Quiet inquiries from Jarls who've grown tired of ruling through intimidation, who wonder if there might be another way. Your healing knowledge, the changes in our household, they want to understand how it works." In the months since the failed attack, the hall had indeed become something unprecedented in their corner of the world. The rigid hierarchy that had once defined every interaction had given way to something more flexible, more human. Servants still served and lords still led, but the relationships were built on mutual respect rather than fear. Sigrid had blossomed in this new atmosphere, her laughter once again echoing through corridors that had known too much silence. The child had become a bridge between the formal structure of the hall and its warmer reality, equally comfortable seeking her father's guidance on important matters and helping Freydis gather herbs for the healing stores. "Papa says you're going to marry him," she announced one afternoon, appearing at Freydis' side with the directness that only children possess. "Is that true?" Freydis paused in her work, choosing her words carefully. "Would that make you happy or sad?" "Happy," Sigrid replied without hesitation. "Because then you couldn't leave, even if other people said mean things about you. And because Papa smiles when he looks at you, the same way he used to smile at Mama." The simplicity of the child's acceptance brought tears to Freydis' eyes. In Sigrid's mind, there was no conflict between honoring her mother's memory and welcoming new love into their lives. The capacity for joy, it seemed, was not diminished by being shared. That evening, as the household gathered for the evening meal, Einar rose from his place at the high table. The great hall fell quiet, not from fear as it once had, but from the respectful attention given to someone whose words carried weight, because they were thoughtfully chosen. "This hall has seen many changes," he began, his voice carrying easily. through the room. We have learned that strength comes not from the ability to inflict fear, but from the courage to inspire loyalty. We have discovered that leadership means serving those who follow us, not simply commanding their obedience. His gaze found Freydis among the assembled faces, and the warmth in his expression made her heart race. But the greatest change has been personal, he continued. I had forgotten what it meant to hope, to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. I had convinced myself that emptiness was strength, that isolation was safety. One woman's courage in the face of injustice taught me otherwise. He descended from the high table, moving through the hall until he stood before her. In his hands, he carried something wrapped in fine cloth, something that seemed to glow with its own inner light. This is my grandmother's marriage crown, he said, unwrapping the object to reveal a circlet of silver worked with intricate knotwork patterns. It has not been worn since my mother's wedding day, because I believe that such traditions belong to a softer world than the one we inhabit. The hall held its collective breath as he knelt before her, the crown held carefully in his hands. But you have shown me that we create the world we inhabit through our choices, our actions, our willingness to believe in better possibilities. Will you wear this crown, Freydis? Will you stand beside me not as a servant who found shelter, but as the woman who helped me remember what it means to be fully alive? The silver circlet seemed to pulse with the weight of history and the promise of the future. Around them, the hall's residents watched with expressions ranging from joy to wonder, all of them understanding that they were witnessing something that would be spoken of for generations. Yes, Freydis whispered, then louder. Yes, I will. As Einar placed the crown on her head, the hall erupted in celebration, not the forced cheer of subjects trying to please their lord, but the genuine joy of a family welcoming a new member. The transformation was complete, marked not by conquest or ceremony, but by the simple recognition of what had been growing between them all along. Later, as the festivities continued around them, Freydis and Einar stood together on the halls. Great steps, looking out over the fjord where ice floes caught the light of the setting sun. The silver ring on her finger had been joined by others, tokens of commitment that spoke of shared tomorrows and the promise of continued growth. Do you think they'll come for us again? She asked, thinking of the Jarls who had tried to force their retreat into the old ways. Perhaps, Einar replied, his arm tightening around her waist. But if they do, they'll find something they weren't. Prepared for a household that fights not from desperation, but from the knowledge that what they've built together is worth defending. In the distance, a ship appeared on the horizon, not flying the colors of war, but those of trade and diplomacy. Word of their success had indeed spread, and with it had come opportunities they could never have imagined dot as the new tapestry in the great hall would later depict. This was not an ending but a beginning. The image would show a woman placing wildflowers on a grave while a man and child waited nearby, honoring the past while embracing the future. Below them, the hall would be shown in full celebration, its people gather around a great fire that burned not with the harsh light of conflict, but with the warm glow of home dot, and in the center of it all, two figures would stand hand in hand, not as lord and servant, conqueror and conquered, but as partners who had chosen to build something new from the ashes of old pain. Sometimes, the tapestry would suggest the greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments. When we choose hope over fear, healing over harm, and love over the safety of empty solitude.